So it is summertime, and that means it's hot. And that also means the bass may not be biting as well as you had hoped. So what lures do you throw? Let's talk about it. Well, how's it going, everybody, and welcome back to Tyler's Reel Fishing. Today, as you saw in the intro, it is hot. It is summertime. I'm sweating my butt off here in Texas, and so I wanted to sit down and make a video on how to catch fish in the summertime with my top 5 lures. Now, of course, we know that summer varies, bigly, that's not a word.
Big league.
Summer varies a lot based on the state that you're in and based on, of course, the weather. But I'm gonna try to make this video as comprehensive as physically possible for every state in America, whether you're in Florida fishing summer, Texas, Alabama, Illinois, or Maine. I want this video to be applicable to almost all of you guys. Now, we all know summer is an incredible time to throw a topwater lure because fish are active, especially in the morning, in the evening, and they're oftentimes chasing bait fish, and so a topwater is a great application to catch those fish. And the one that I throw the most often in the summertime is a topwater walking bait. This here is the Striking Sexy Dog. You can throw a spook, you can throw a Lucky Craft, really whatever it is, any bait that walks the surface. And if you are unfamiliar with what this bait does and what I mean by walk the surface, what these baits do is they basically, I guess a walk is a good way to say it. They go side to side with a twitch of the rod tip, and it really allows this bait to not only make some good noise because of the rattles, stay in one place for a decent amount of time. You're not like plopping like a popper or a frog. You'd be bringing over a longer distance with each twitch of the rod. This allows the bait to stay in the strike zone for a very long time. And also the profile is of course the most like a bait fish we have in, at least all of my topwater lures that I throw. The spook is the most similar to a bait fish. And so I'm usually throwing a 2 hook setup like this, usually a 3.5, 4 inch kind. But if you have some big bait fish or some big, forage in your lake, oftentimes I will throw this big one here. This is the Striking Magnum Dog or something dog, big one. It's a big one. And as you can see, it is almost twice as long as a regular spook. But let's say you're fishing in New York or Minnesota, you don't have a lot of open water to throw this thing. You don't have a lot of rocks and really open water, wood kind of stuff to throw this spook around. You're gonna have to throw a frog or a different type of topwater that can, get those fish out of the cover that you're fishing. But especially in Texas, I'd say the majority of the time in the mornings, I'm throwing a topwater spook. Now the gear that I'm throwing this on, I'm gonna go over the gear on every single lure that I discuss. The gear that I throw this on really varies on how far of a cast I have to make. So if I'm throwing this big old spook right here and I have to make a super long cast over a big main lake point, I'm gonna throw this on a 7/6 medium or medium heavy. And that is just because I have to get this thing a really long distance, and a long rod helps with that. And of course, because this bait is heavier and I'm gonna throwing it farther, I need a heavier pound braid on this thing. And so usually it's a 40 to 60 pound braid on this one. Whereas with this smaller spook, I'm usually throwing this on 20 to 40 pound braid. Of course, if I'm fishing it around heavy cover, I'll throw it on 50, 65. But just because it is a lighter bait, I want to be able to cast it further, and a lighter braid helps with that. And about a 7.2 to 7.4 medium heavy to heavy is about what I throw on this spook as well. So that kind of covers my base as far as it comes to topwaters. Like I said, I'm leaving out a ton of lures. I know that a frog could work, a whopper plopper could work, a popper could work, whatever you're most comfortable with. I'm just giving you my opinion on what I think works best all around the country for both largemouth, smallmouth, and spotted bass. So now that my topwater baits are out of the way, let's move on to my one moving bait I have in this category, the deep crankbait. Now, fair warning, this lure right here will not be applicable to you guys that are fishing in shallow ponds. There are some deep ponds of which you can throw a deep crankbait, but this is more for your deeper ponds in your bass boat in a lake sort of thing, because this bait dives to about 16 to 18 feet of water. And of course, I do throw ones that are classified deep divers that are a little bit shallower than that, and then I throw ones that are much deeper than that to dive to 25 feet. And so you are gonna have a time of your life trying to throw this in a 6-foot deep pond, because you're just gonna do nothing but dredge up the mud and the grass. And so this here, the reason why I throw this and pick this for especially the late summertime is because a ton of the fish, I'd say the majority, left the banks from their spawn, post-spawn, feeding time, and they are going down to the bottom of the lake. I'm not talking like 50 feet bottom. Of course, some lakes like Table Rock and all those deeper clear lakes, the bass actually do go to 50 feet. But most of the time, they're gonna head out to that 16 to 25 feet of water, and they're gonna chill out there and wait for something big to swim by their face. And that is when this big crankbait does a great job of getting these fish to bite. And so I've made videos before. I'll have a video linked up here on how to, deep crank. I'll probably do a better instructional on this at some point throughout the summer, and maybe in the winter time, because I do throw these in the winter as well. But the deep crankbait is definitely one of my favorite lures for the summertime to get a bite, because oftentimes you'll be out there and you'll graph over a school of fish and you'll see them. You'll throw a Texas rig, you'll throw a jig. They won't bite, but what they need is something fast and in their face to get them to react. And oftentimes this can catch the biggest bass in the school every single time. So deep crankbait is definitely one of my favorite choices, and the gear that I throw deep crankbait on, and of course all the gear that I use, not just in this video but in every video, will be linked in the product description below. And so the rod and reel that I throw is usually a 7/6 medium heavy crankbait rod with the LURES BB1 speed spool, my favorite crankbait reel out there. And of course, it depends what type of cover you're fishing. So if you're fishing some like really jagged rocks or wood, I would stick to 12-pound fluorocarbon for this. But if you have open water, just rocks, 10-pound fluoro will get this crankbait to the maximum depth that it can get to, which is of course ideal for fishing a deep crank. Now the next three lures are going to be fairly deep lures. So of course, this is more for your lake fishermen than your pond fishermen, but they are a football jig, a shaky head, and a drop shot. So let's start with the football jig. If you've never seen a football jig, I will link an instructional that I did a few years ago on how to fish a football jig. But it is, deemed that name because the head of the jig is shaped like a football. And the reasoning for why it's called a football jig is because you want to be able to create the maximum amount of disturbance on the bottom as possible to get those fish to eat this thing. And so that's why the football head, the fat in the middle and, slendered off on the sides, but of course horizontally, not vertically. When you drag this thing, it basically pushes rocks, gravel, dirt, everything. And I've seen this thing underwater. It creates a nice mud trail or whatever the bottom is like, a sand trail. That fish can key on this bait and of course eat this thing. And some of my biggest summertime bass have come on the football jig. It is not a bait that you catch a lot of fish on. Beware, it's not a numbers bait, not a Cinco or a drop shot, as we'll talk about here in a second. It is a big fish bait. And so if you want to catch some of the biggest bass of your life here in the summertime, a football jig is going to be the way to go. I like to keep colors with football jigs pretty simple. So if I know the fish are eating bluegills, it is either a green pumpkin or a watermelon. If they're eating crawfish, it is usually a green pumpkin with some orange or blue mixed in. And if the water's really dirty, it is almost always black and blue. I don't like to go into the crazy colors, the green pumpkin, magic flake, purple, whatever. I don't like to go into crazy colors because the science has showed, and I've seen on video, that the deeper a lure gets, the less color really matters. The fish can only see, I believe, like pink and brown when it gets really deep. And so that's why I just stick to any sort of green pumpkin or watermelon type football jig. And that kind of goes for everything when I'm fishing deep in the summertime. So whether it's the football jig, the shaky head, or the drop shot, there's not a whole lot of variance that I go with colors. It is either green pumpkin, watermelon, black and blue, and occasionally I will throw a straight black shaky head. And so with the football jig, my combo is almost always, I believe I have it out. Do I not have it out? I put the rod up last night, but it is my, it's a LURES Custom Speed Stick 7.3 heavy football jig. And it is the perfect amount of backbone, but also length. And a good enough soft tip to get this football jig out there. And I just loved it. I have no problem setting the hook and no problem get this bait decent away from the boat. And of course, I put this thing on usually 17-pound fluorocarbon. If the water's really clear, I'll drop down to 15. But with a football jig and this super heavy hook, this is an Outcast football jig, it is really hard to get this hook into the fish's mouth. And so you need not only that heavy rod, but a little bit stiffer of a line in order to get that hook in the mouth. So 12-pound line, you might have a little bit of trouble because there's the thinness of the line to get this thick wire hook into their mouth. And this next bait that we're going to talk about, number 4 of 5, is by far the largest lure in this category and is definitely the biggest fish catcher of the summer for me. And that is when I'm fishing offshore rock, offshore grass, and offshore brush piles. And that is the giant shaky head. When I first saw someone fishing this, I think Josh Benson, my college partner freshman year, was the first guy I ever saw throw a shaky head this big. And I thought he was crazy. I thought there's no way a fish, of course, with only the hook being on this portion, I mean, longer than my hand, my whole forearm here doesn't even have a hook on it. And so I was curious how a fish would be able to get this thing inside of his mouth. Until I did some underwater footage, as you guys have seen on the channel, and I started to see that these fish would eat the lure almost always head first. And so that is why this thing is such a big fish catcher, because not only does it have a very long worm, very big profile to get the big fish's attention, but it also has a big, beefy, shaky head. This here is a 3/4 ounce. So again, this is more for your lake fishermen than your pond anglers. But I found this thing, if you can find a brush pile with at least 1 or 2 fish in it, this will pull the biggest fish out of the school. And my buddy Josh, as I was just talking about, he got 2nd place in the Costa tournament on Sam Rayburn that you won like $16,000 on. Almost this exact combo. I think a slightly different worm, but this here is the Strike King, I believe it's the KVD giant worm. What's it called? It is this pack of worms here, the bull worm. It is a 10-inch worm, comes in a 5-pack, and not sponsored to say it, but I love these things. They are incredible worms. Have a cool little, tail split there to give it some action, and they just catch big fish. And so the combo that I throw with this is almost always a 7-6 to, I film this thing on an 8-foot rod, because you have to have a big rod, like I said, to set the hook, this hook into the mouth, but also to be able to get a long cast, you have to have a super long rod. And the weight difference between this and the football jig is pretty drastic. This is almost an ounce and a half, and this is just 3/4 ounce. So it's like, double the weight on this thing, and so you have to have some beefy gear to throw this, and that will all be linked down in the description below. Now, going from the giant shaky head worm to our bait number 5 is quite a drastic change, and that is the Dropshot. Now, the Dropshot I threw in there because not only does it catch fish here in Texas, both largemouth, smallmouth, and spots, it also is an incredible smallmouth catcher up north for you guys that are watching this video. And so the Dropshots that I like to have is usually a slightly longer leader than I will have the rest of the year. So summertime fish tend to either sit directly on the bottom, and if that's the case, the football jig and the shaky head will catch those fish. But if those fish are sitting off the bottom at all, they'll be suspended. And so a drop shot with usually I fish a 1.5 to a 3-foot leader is a great way to get those suspended fish to bite, especially if you're on lakes like Gunnersville, Pickwick, Kentucky Lake, that you have a ton of pressure. A Nico rig is a great rig as well, but I found the drop shot gets more bites than the Nico rig, and oftentimes can get some pretty big fish to bite. And of course, everybody loves fighting big fish on a spinning rod. And so the gear that I throw this on is usually the TP1 6.9 medium light. I don't have it in the boat with me right now. With the custom speed spin, this is the inshore model, some 15-pound Seagar Smackdown braid, and then, oh, I almost hooked my friend, and some 8-pound Seagar Tatsu leader with a different drop shot setup that a lot of people use. So when you search drop shot on YouTube, you'll usually find a nose hooked bait. So it's usually a tiny size 1 or size 2 drop shot hook. It's a little like circle hook. But I've actually found that I can get not only more weedless action, I can fish a bigger worm and catch bigger fish on a small wide gap hook. This here, hopefully you can see it, it is a 1/0. This is about the smallest I've ever thrown on a wide gap hook, but I'm able to, because it's a light wire hook, I don't need a big heavy rod to set the hook into them. And so if I throw a robo worm, let's say, or a 5-inch worm on this thing, it has enough hook to actually, fit the bait perfectly, and you're not getting stuck in the brush piles of the grass that's down there. So I found that throwing it on a wide gap hook, at least for me, is a lot more successful than a nose hook. And then I have a 1/8 ounce tungsten drop shot weight. Really, it doesn't matter if it's tungsten or not, because you're not really feeling the bottom, you're kind of just hopping it down there. But I do have a few tungstens laying around, so that's the one that I'm using. And so that is my top 5 lures for summertime. Again, if you have any questions, as always, leave them down in the comment section below. If you want me to make any instructional videos on how to work any one of these 5 lures individually, drop that in the comment section below. I'd love to help you guys out. Moving forward in this channel, I'm going to have at least 1 instructional video a week. So of course, any instructionals or techniques or whatever you guys want to learn, I'm here to teach you guys, and of course, have a good time catching some big bass. So subscribe to this channel if you guys have not yet, and we'll see you guys on the next episode of TRF.